case you missed the big context for this morning, the IEC had initially given an assurance that 90% of the votes would be counted by now, or at least by midnight yesterday. So far, we're still sitting with 58% of those votes being counted. I'm going to bring up that board for you, that leaderboard that we always reference around this time. And it's showing there that that 58% has actually been on for quite some time. Nonetheless, the ANC still leading. I'm going to just look over my shoulder. It's at 46%. It's followed by the Democratic Alliance with 4.5% it appears for the Inkatha Freedom Party. But there's so much else to consider. The projections are already out for many of the metros, and the numbers are shocking to say the least. However, there's still speculation, if you like, around the situation in Ethekwini. So to discuss this matter and plenty others, let's bring in our resident political analyst, Tasneem Essop, who joins us now with us here in studio. And Tasneem, it's great again to bring you back into the discussion. I wonder what kind of considerations you reckon ought to be made for the city of Ethekwini, or the metro of Ethekwini. News 24 is yet to release their projections so far. However, polling by the CSIR has shown that the ANC again losing quite badly, at least in KZN as a whole.
Yeah, well, we'll have to see if that turns into another hung municipality and a metro, of course, at that. So that would be very interesting. Of course, the context around Ethekwini is what happened in July, right?
Yeah.
So that's KZN and of course Gauteng, but certainly KZN where everything really took off. So the unrest in July and all of the events that happened around there would feed into that. It's been part of the election campaign, from the DA side, and there was the whole fumble with the Phoenix posters. But just more broadly, speaking to the socioeconomic, the political context there, and how that popular moment, one of the biggest popular moments we've seen in a very long time in South Africa, how that has shaped, the electoral results.
There had been so much attention, I don't know about you, but whenever I think of Ethekwini, Zandile Gumede comes to mind, the former mayor of that region. I mean, she essentially, according to some, had brought the region into disrepute, at least once you consider the ANC's image there because of the corruption allegations against her. One wonders how much of that became a feature when it comes to how people decide how to vote, at least how they voted on Monday.
Sure. Well, corruption is a feature of this election, across the board, and certainly perceptions of corruption have shaped conversations around the election, right? So, I mean, in 2016, we started to see this already, where the national conversation, the pace of the election was very much around corruption. And once again, in the local government election, here again, we're talking about corruption. It's been a significant feature across many municipalities, and certainly with the kind of coverage that's happened in Ethekwini, it is a feature. And it does matter for people when they go into the ballot box. This is undeniable when we're talking about the key issues of the election. We're talking about corruption, electricity, water. It's these kind of like basic things that come into consideration.
Yeah. Interesting to note the conversations being had if the front pages of the newspapers today are anything to go by. But I want to just hone in on a reflection specifically on the start. Don't worry, I know perhaps you haven't gotten a chance to glance at it. But the thrust of the discussion there is essentially questions around whether or not the arrest of Ace Magashule and the arrest of former President Jacob Zuma may have a direct link to the poor showing by the ANC at the polls. I find it quite ironic because you'll remember Ace Magashule was asked to step aside from the organization because the ANC was hoping that would help them appear to be drawing a line in the sand when it comes to their stance against corruption. But do you envision a scenario, a context where it's had the opposite effect, where ironically coming down on such a senior leader has had a negative impact on the ANC at the polls?
So, I mean, it's interesting. It's almost counterintuitive, right?
Exactly.
When you hear it, that, these are the leaders that have, them stepping aside or being arrested means that the ANC is in a worse position. So I think overall, right, the ANC's been in disarray, right? And that has to be taken into consideration in this conversation. So we can look at particular figures and how they might play in particular areas, right? With the kind of support base and constituencies that they might hold in those areas. But just if you're looking at it broadly, the ANC's lost, pretty much. We're looking at major losses across the board for the ANC.
Nationally,
right?
below 50% for the first time, potentially.
And that's got to be a bigger conversation about the state of the party, right? And even if you want to look at those figures, there are many who have been critical of Ramaphosa for acting slow, or let me not say just Ramaphosa, the leadership of the ANC, right? For being slow to act on certain things in the party, cleaning up the party. And we saw on the campaign trail, the ANC was talking about being apologetic, talking about renewal again, talking about fixing itself. And I think that's all come into it, right? So how disgruntled are voters with the ANC as an organization, as a ruling party, as a party that's been running their municipalities? And this is a local government, and local issues will feed into that, right? So that local performance, the engagement with your local municipality, with your local ANC will be part of that.
Yeah. Speaking about local governance issues, I mean, it's almost a foregone conclusion that all these metros, barring the city of Cape Town, are going to be governed through a coalition. However, this is all in a context where we really are inexperienced, let's be frank, as a democracy when it comes to how coalitions can be run. Do you imagine there is room for legislation that sort of, I guess, governs how a coalition government may take place, if I'm making sense?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, this is politics, right? And yes, I mean, there can be legislation that's up to legislators who are politicians, right? And I mean, there's been a lot of talk about the kind of political maturity that's required for coalitions, the kind of compromise that's required for coalitions. I think the bottom line is that to go into successful coalitions, you can't have positions that are too diverse from each other, right? What that means is that when parties are standing here over the week and telling us we won't go into coalition with X, Y, and Z, that becomes a bit of a problem, right? You've got to agree on how you want to run a particular metro or municipality, and the positions on the extremes will have to come into some kind of compromise, right? So, I mean, it's interesting. Our political system is set up in a way for coalitions, particularly in places like the metros, as we've seen, because of the PR situation that goes on when we go to vote, right? And this is going to be a conversation when we get to national and provincial elections too, in the next round. So it's going to be more of a feature of our electoral politics,
Absolutely.
right? And it's just about parties, coming to that position where they can. And it's clear from the electorate, those who have gone and voted, that this is the desired outcome.
It was the Deputy Secretary General of the ANC speaking to my colleague Stephen Furtis yesterday here at The Rock, who mentioned that, as far as she's concerned, coalitions are transactional. In other words, an organization will only get into coalition talks with another party if they feel they have something to benefit from it. Yes,
absolutely. I mean, that is unfortunately the position that's going to be the position of most of the political parties, right? Is how will we benefit coming out of this, right? So there'll also be long-term thinking. If we go into this kind of coalition, what do we stand to benefit as a party? Remember that most of the parties that are going to go into coalitions are looking to grow. They're looking for growth over a longer period of time. So that kind of benefit for the political party has to be there. That's politics. But at the end of the day, can we have representation of people who live in those areas, a true form of representation and accountability, right? That really has to be at the center of a conversation about local government.
Absolutely. You speak about representation as well. I can't help but think, and I think this is going to be a big feature, by the way, in the reflections after this entire election season. I can't help but think of the participation rate of this election, right? We've been speaking a lot about voter turnout, which, as I explained earlier, is really just a proportion of the people who registered to vote who actually rocked up. However, there's a conversation to be had around a proportion of those who are eligible to vote who ended up actually casting their votes on Monday. That figure is way lower and paints a whole lot more of a grim picture around the level of buy-in or lack thereof in our democratic ecosystem.
Sure. I mean, you're looking at around 13 million of the voting age population who did not register. And then we'll, of course, wait for the final stats on the actual voter turnout. But, I mean, it's millions of South Africans who did not cast their ballot, who would not have shaped this election.
What does that mean when we speak about the voice of the people? Sorry, I mean, that's often what, is cited. An election is the people deciding. But in a context like ours, quite literally, a minority of people actually had their voice heard in some instance, at least through the casting of a ballot paper.
Sure. Well, I think the message from non-voters is also there, and has been analyzed around that political decision not to vote, that choice not to vote, right, and what that says about our political system. And that's where the conversation's really been, because it's so important to take into consideration that, so many people are disillusioned by this electoral system, right? I mean, it comes back to me, for me, it comes back to the fact that democracy has to be more than just casting your ballot, right? And we know that South Africans are politically active people, right? We know this from other forms of politics that we see people engaging in. And so how do we get to a point where people are able to participate democratically, and perhaps we want those numbers of people voting to go up, but that kind of democratic participation is broad and it's meaningful, and that people want to cast a ballot because it's part of a bigger process of democracy.
Sure. Of course, there have been all kinds of discussions around coalitions being inevitable, but has anything taken you by surprise so far?
Not really. Perhaps the Western Cape a little bit, the number of hung municipalities in the Western Cape. I think it's up to 14 that we're looking at now, that are hung municipalities. So I think that's going to be interesting. And, the DA's kind of proportion of vote has gone down there. I think, in the city of Johannesburg, we were expecting a coalition. It was already a coalition from 2016, but it's going to be very interesting because of new players on the block. So that's going to be an interesting conversation moving forward. And then I'm also tracking Mpumalanga, particularly how EFF is performing in a lot of areas in Mpumalanga. And of course, Standerton is one of the big ones.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Tasneem, there are many considerations to be made, and luckily you've made time to make those considerations with us throughout the course of our broadcast here. For now, thanks very much indeed for giving us your thoughts around where we're at and where we're likely to be headed. Tasneem Essop is a political analyst, our resident political analyst here for the AM Report.